So tonight we'll start with our crowdsourced news update, and I'm afraid to say that we've got no Bob tonight. Usually we have Bob Davis, the chair of the Road Danger Reduction Forum, who does sort of a kind of a short news item for us, but unfortunately he's had to go into hospital for a few days. So we're all kind of wishing him well and hoping that goes well, and hopefully we'll have him back soon. Tonight we also have Susannah Walker, one of the founders of Make Space for Girls, who's going to talk about designing public space for girls with a particular focus on parks and some of the work they've been doing. And we also have Ranty Highwayman here somewhere, I hope, who is going to do his good, the bad and the interesting slot for us. So on that note, can I invite people who do have news to share to put a hand up? Let us know what's going on in your area, or if you want, there's a sort of item of national interest that you'd like to flag up. We'd really like to hear that. And Mark, I was going to ask you whether you would have anything to share. Do you want to start us off?
Well, thanks. It's a shame about Bob. So hopefully we all wish him well, and he's been tweeting various stuff about his illness. No, it's just something locally about Brighton that some of you may have picked up about. There's an interruption in the Brighton bike share scheme, and that's to do with the phone. The bikes are run on 3G phones, which are being withdrawn, and it's basically impossible to keep on going beyond the start of the next year. So it's a bit of a disappointment, but there'll be a new scheme coming up next year, and don't believe everything you see in the press about it if you're watching bike share schemes. I can't tell you who's won the tender. There will be a new tender, but I can't tell you yet, although most people locally, I think, do know about it.
That's good to know. Thanks, Mark. And Ruth, you've got a hand up.
Hi, yes, although I'm a Londoner and currently in the Netherlands, where cycling is amazing, I heard from a relative that in Harrogate they've had funding for cycling and plans in place since 2017, but the council are obfuscating and blocking and blocking and blocking and blocking. And even though Harrogate District Cycling, I think they're called, are heavily involved, they're getting nowhere. They've written to Active Travel England and still not really heard anything further. And it's very hard work and very depressing for these people, because they put a huge amount into cycling and safe cycling and have created lots of amazing things like the Harrogate to Ripley cycleway. So I don't know what one does when one's in a council like that, where you just cannot make any headway. So a bit depressing then. Thank you. Yeah,
it is, and it's something we hear a lot, particularly I think smaller towns find it really, really hard to sort of get that kind of campaigning momentum as well. So it will be interesting to see, I think, what Active Travel England, whether that can make any difference there. I can see, I think you've all changed order. Ali Stansfield, you're next on my list.
Yeah, just exciting Sustrans bits and bobs. So we've just got our new staff starting to do school streets in 2 new, I guess, boroughs rather than cities is the word. So South Tyneside and Sefton both have new school streets offices. And the opening of, if any of you have heard of the Stockton hub in the Tees Valley, the opening of, I believe, 4 new hubs across the Tees Valley. And I think they all just got their bikes this week to do lead rides and bike maintenance and what have you. Yeah, I wouldn't be in my keep if I didn't give you little Sustrans updates every time I was on.
Thanks, Ali. Always good to have some good news. Becky Reynolds.
Thanks. I've this afternoon attended the virtual meeting of Transport for the South East. They're finalising their 45 billion 27-year plan for transport in the whole of the South East. And they're going to, after approval at the board, send it to government. Of course, they're going to be lucky to get all that funding under present conditions. But what the sort of perennial worry is that the road schemes go ahead, and the active travel side is economised on, particularly as some of the local authorities are not very good at providing active travel, even with funding. They're not even providing funding. And for example, right at this minute, Eastbourne is still pursuing this idea of the town centre having no cycling at all, using the highway code as a justification. And Medway didn't apply for any active travel funding. So if you're in the Southeast, Google Transport for the Southeast, and the documents in their board papers for the 14th of November. Thanks.
Thanks, Becky. That's a really useful update. Max, you got your hand up.
Hello, joining for the first time, so thank you, and good rebrand, because I don't think I would have joined the old name. Just a quick update from Westminster Council, which changed hands in May, in which I'm part of the cabinet there. From next week, we're installing camera enforcement at 7 of our 12 experimental school streets, which the previous administration refused to do, and it's great because it's, without any enforcement, we've seen parents and teachers trying to intervene and actually being assaulted at the school closest to where I live in Queen's Park, which is in one of the most deprived bits of Westminster. So it's really positive news, and those should all be installed by the end of next week.
Thanks, Max, and thanks for joining us. And that is really great news. I think, those of us outside of London are kind of really, watching and waiting to see that start to happen. It's kind of getting camera enforcement for school streets. So it's really good to hear that's particularly in Westminster, that's continuing to roll out in London. I'm going to bring in, hang on a second, Steve Pierce. Sorry, I've just had a note in the chat that he isn't able to find the hand up. So Steve, are you there?
I am here, yes, and I've found a bit of a hand. It's not the right one, but never mind.
That's all right.
Thanks. So new caller, so to speak. I'm from Cycle Lewis, so interested in the TFSE and Eastbourne examples, but I've actually got a specific question. We are looking to introduce an AMPR controlled toll on a bridge in Lewis to reduce through traffic, which is the bane of our lives. And I'm wondering whether anyone has got any ideas on what the legislation is that covers that. I know about tolls on new bridges, but I haven't come across anything that relates to tolls on a new toll on an existing bridge.
I don't know if I can answer that. I was going to ask, yes, Mark, do you?
Just as I'm only about 5 miles away, it'd be easier probably just to talk this offline. If you want to drop me in the chat and we'll get in touch. That's probably easier.
Happy to do that, Mark. Thanks.
I already know.
Yes.
God, what's her name? Can't remember. I've been always in touch with the cycle.
Sheila,
so, yeah, Sheila. That's it.
Yep.
So,
thanks,
great.
Mark. I'll do that.
Fantastic to matchmake you. Claire, do you want to come in?
Thanks, Sally. Yeah, a week's a long time in the active travel world, isn't it? But a week ago, we had Sarah Story, who's the active travel commissioner for Greater Manchester. She has been in the post for 4 months or so, and so she revealed her kind of refreshed mission, if she calls it. And so I'll just share some of the headlines of what she wants to focus on in Greater Manchester. Big focus on what she called universal accessibility, and I think obviously with herself having a degree of disability, that's perhaps not to be not a surprise, but she really comes across really sort of powerfully and talks really eloquently about all the benefits that brings in terms of different types of people, older people, younger people, families. And so I think this focus on accessibility is really welcome from her. And she has followed that up later in the week with a tweet where she flagged, we've been crowdsourcing a map of barriers around Greater Manchester, which she tweeted out for us this week, which we thought was rather nice. So yeah, universal accessibility, big focus. But interestingly, her top priority was, as to be expected, was on building high quality infrastructure. And within that kind of category of infrastructure, she wants there to be a bigger focus on longer routes. think there's been a sort of feeling that, you know, there's been these sort of little itty bitty things that don't join up. So in terms of future funding schemes in Greater Manchester, wanting those funding proposals to focus on either longer routes or routes that link other bits up. And there's actually a review going on at the moment of the aspirational B network, which was the kind of map that was drawn when Chris Boardman first started, that was, you know, never had any money attached to it, but is the sort of aspirational B network map. So there's a review of that going on to see how much of it could kind of be unlocked with fairly simple, you know, bits of linking up. The other thing that was focus of that infrastructure priority was things that link routes that link to public transport. As Sarah Story was appointed at the same time as a transport commissioner. So we have a transport commissioner and an active travel commissioner here, Transport Commissioner Vernon Everett, who has started out with a big focus on ticketing and integrated ticketing. But I think the more and more we see in Greater Manchester, the active travel is being talked about as this kind of first and last mile to get you to and from active public transport, not exclusively, but so I think it is useful for campaigners to kind of go with that. I don't see a problem with that. I think that is a useful way of thinking about things, but we're still very, as Walk Ride, the campaign group that I represent, still very focused on the active travel bit. And so, yeah, just lastly, I think it was really good to see her putting these priorities out there. And the other thing that she wanted to see when asked what's the one thing you'd like to see by the end of next year was bikes on trams in Greater Manchester, which is one of our campaign goals, and had kind of gone very quiet under Andy Burnham without a transport and active travel commissioner. So we're really pleased to see her push that one back up the table. And I think that one's it's a kind of like a symbolic thing. Bikes on trams, you know, it's not the be all and end all of what we want as active travel campaigners, but it's become this kind of symbol of transport bodies that don't really get it. So hopefully that will be happening anytime soon. I'll put a link to our thread in the chat and the document that she published. Thanks, Sally.
Thanks, Claire. That's really interesting about those priorities, I think. Yeah, I mean, from what I understand in Newcastle as well, I think that some of that's very much coming from Active Travel England. We've heard the same thing, focus on long routes, focus on gaps in, you know, trying to connect bits of, because I mean, I imagine you've got lots of bits of things that have been built over the last few years that nothing connects up. If it's anything like here, that's and that's really, in some way, that's really good. And we also have this, like, kind of the last mile and the link with public transport, which, yeah, I think I'm also have some reservations about a focus on that, and that becoming very much about commuting then, and not about local journeys and what that means for who is then kind of prioritized in terms of active travel. But yeah, it's kind of interesting to hear that that's, you know, the same sort of similar messaging coming out. So thanks, everybody. If nobody else has any news to share, we will move on to our first speaker. Susannah, where are you? I just had you before. There you are. Do you want to share your slides, and I'll let you get started?
I will do that. And while I'm sharing my slides, I'm going to explain kind of in a bit while we're here, although I've lost PowerPoints. We could all be here all day. Here we go. That there's two things. One is that, in a way, we represent thinking about how gender affects the built environment more generally. It's just that parks are such a specific example where the problems are so clear that, in a way, it's a really good way into thinking about how gender then impinges in other ways. The second thing is, and which we've had to say a lot, is that if you want to get girls involved in active travel, we have to give them something to go to in the first place. And at the moment, that for teenage girls, that's really lacking. So that's kind of why we're here. And now I will see if it will let me share my screen. Yes. No, we're not there yet. Right, here we go. So right at the start, when we began Make Space for Girls, and we were really just trying to find out whether there was a problem and what was going on, I met Lily, who's the daughter of a friend of mine, in the street. And I said to her, so do you go to the park? And she gave me the 14-year-old death stare and just said that there's nothing there for me. And that in that, she absolutely encapsulated the problem that Make Space for Girls is here to solve, which is that teenage girls have nothing to do in parks and public spaces. So the upshot of that conversation and a few others, and then talking to a good friend of mine who was an equalities lawyer who went, I think we've got an equalities issue here. We ended up being a charity. We campaign to make all public spaces as welcoming to teenage girls as they are to teenage boys, and then hopefully a bit more than that. It's about rethinking the way we approach spaces and what we normally do. We help councillors and developers to try something new. And it's about starting these conversations, as I'm sure you must know from active travel, right at the beginning of a scheme, not trying to bodge something in right at the end where you just end up with something terrible, but to get the idea of the needs of teenage girls, the idea of thinking about things in gender terms there from the start. So what's the problem? At the moment, almost everything that is in parks, quote unquote, for teenagers is a skate park, a mooga, you know, one of those fence pitches, or a basketball court, or both, or a BMX track. All of those are dominated by boys. We've only really got statistics for skate parks, which is 80 to 85% male users. Moogas, we suspect, are probably worse, but nobody's ever actually counted who uses them. But the thing we want to stress is that you need to fix the things, not the girls, because the obvious thing to do is go, oh, well, there's a skate park, let's teach the girls to skateboard. But we actually need to step back and go, well, what do the girls want to do? Do they want to skateboard? Spoiler alert, not that many of them do. I want to just very quickly go through a couple of the specifics of why these things are problematic. And again, these are examples for how we need to think about public space differently. So it's just about getting ahead into that space. This is what Biz said. Biz is not a shrinking violet, but Biz would not go into the Mooga comfortably. And frankly, who can blame her? It's got 3-meter high fences, narrow entrances. It's full of teenage boys who you probably don't know. I'd have a problem going into it as an adult woman. But we build these spaces and expect that they can be universally accessed by everybody. And they're not. They end up being dominated by a small group of teenage boys, because the other point is that a lot of what we provide actually doesn't cater for some teenage boys as well. So the most dominant group will always take over a space. This is particularly true of skate parks, where, again, I met Izzy was cycling in a car park. I said, why are you not on the skate park? It's just up the road. And she said that. So they get, and we've talked to girls who've had stones thrown at them, who've had racial abuse to get them off the skate park, girls who've had rape threats. You know, it's really not pretty. But the good thing about what skate parks and Moogas do is that they do at least give a sign to teenage boys that they are welcome in a space, and that you're never going to get cleared off a Mooga or a skate park for being a teenage boy. You're meant to be there. So what we need to do is create spaces that welcome teenage girls in the same way and tell them that it's okay for them to be out in public space. Why do we need to do this? One is just basic fairness, equality, not discrimination. You know, well, why not? It's also particularly crucial for teenagers because teenagers don't have autonomy in anywhere except in public spaces. They're told what to do at home. They're told what to do at school. They need to be in public space in order to grow into independent individuals. And teenage play, unfortunately, looks a lot like messing about and loitering with your friends. But we kind of need to get over that. Health, it's really important. Teenage girls are less active than teenage boys at every stage of being a teenager, but we never associate that with the fact that we don't give them anything to be active on. But more importantly, there's increasing research about access to green space and mental health. So it's really important in a world where teenage girls are 3 times more likely to have a mood disorder than teenage boys that we get them outside. It's a simple fix. Let's do it. And safety. One of the big barriers for girls using public spaces is safety, and they have a right to be outside, and we need to fix that. There's also the law, which is really interesting. The UN Rights of the Child says that every person under the age of 18 has a right to play, And we're not very good at dealing with that with teenagers generally in the UK, but we absolutely don't provide anything for teenage girls. But the Equality Act, which is basically why we exist, is also really interesting, because it says under the public sector equality duty, it says that all public bodies have a duty not just to consider equality in their decision making, but to act to redress inequalities and to bring in marginalised groups to do something. So there's a clear legal duty on councils that they actually have to do something about this, and not having the data and not knowing is not an excuse. And that's really why we exist, because it's all very well walking around going, wouldn't it nice, and be nice, and everyone go, well, we don't have any budget, so sorry, but you have a legal duty is much more interesting. So what do teenagers want from public space? This is not quite all the answers, because it was done by Women in Sport and Yorkshire Sport. So it's about what would you be active in the playground. Actually, the single thing that teenage girls want most of all is social seating. They want to sit around in groups and be able to face each other and chat. But it's still useful. And what's really interesting is that not even the boys want what's provided at the moment. They're not very keen on the skate park and the multi-use games area. They'd rather have swings. The girls really want swings. But the other thing is they want places to play. Other bits of research, teenagers say we want somewhere to play, but not where the little kids are. So because they're always being tutted at, because they don't have anything, they go and play on the little kids area, and then the mums all tut at them, and they feel disapproved of. The good news is that we know a lot of the answers, because some really interesting work has been done, very particularly in Scandinavia and Vienna, and there's a lot of research on what works. So better lighting, obviously for safety, circular paths, so if you can see trouble coming, you can go the other way, ideally at the perimeter of the park. Breaking up spaces, and this is really important, because if you give them one space, the most dominant group always takes over. Spoiler alert, that's not often the teenage girls. The more, if you provide lots of different spaces, different groups of boys get to use it as well. LGBTQA plus people get to use, teenagers get to use it. It just works better for everyone. Things I've said: social seating, swings, performance area, and toilets, which are an equality issue. But what does this look like? This is a space in Sweden that was designed with teenage girls. And as you can see, it takes up the space of a Muga, but it does all sorts of different things in it. And it looks nicer. And it's got social seating. It's also got seating under a shelter. I do find the teenage shelter that looks like a kind of abandoned spaceship in the middle of the grass is one of the most depressing things known to mankind. But you can integrate shelter into the park space. You know, that seating could also be a stage. It can be other things. There's more social seating in the corner. It's great. What's not to like? This is really interesting. I'm going to whiz through this. And we can talk about, this is a stage in Vienna. They've done a lot of really good work in Vienna, which I could honestly talk to you about for 40 minutes just on its own. But girls like, particularly younger teenage girls, spaces where they can perform TikTok dances and generally mess around. But interestingly, they've labelled this one as the girls' stage, because it's about giving the girls that permission to be there. It's okay for you to use it. Nobody's going to tell you off. Swings. Teenage girls like swings. We also discovered that whenever we put swings on Twitter, that adult women go, actually, I'm elbowing the teenage girls out of the way. Can I have a go on this, please? This is obviously top of the range, but it's really simple to just have bigger swings. Because what's happened, there used to be swings, and there still are swings, but they've shrunk and they've gone into the little fence around the toddler's play area, so that if the teenage girls use them, they get tutted at by the mums and little kids. Sorry, my thing's a bit jumpy. This is the aspirational swings that one day we will build somewhere, but there are a lot of cheaper, easier ways of doing it. Also, and finally, we're on to active travel. Superkillen in Copenhagen is a really interesting park in a lot of ways. It's not designed for teenage girls, but it works because it's designed to be inclusive. It's got lots of different spaces, but fascinating, the spine of it is a cycle path and a footpath that runs through the whole park, which is really long and thin. So everywhere you go, there are people, and people are the biggest insurers of good behaviour and safety for teenage girls. So if you've got people coming and going all the time, it works for teenage girls. And it's got social seating and swings. So you can see the cycle paths just going through there. It's amazing. To give you the context of this picture, it is 5 degrees. The wind chill factor is something else. I am queuing for these swings because everybody else is using them. They're just brilliant. So and you'll note that a lot of this is a lot cheaper than building a skate park. So this is us. We exist to talk to people. Hello, councillors. Hello, other park bodies. Hello, people like that. We are here to help. We are here to present to people. We are here to give you examples, to talk about the work we're doing elsewhere, to help with consultations with teenage girls. Please talk to us. We like talking to people.
Thank you so much, Susannah. That was really, really fantastic. And I've noted lots of things. I mean, it's my research is into children's play and public space, not just in parks, but yeah, I didn't know about all of those examples though. And it is, I think at the beginning though, and I think this is really of relevance for active travel too, it is drawing the attention to sort of the fundamental things that need to be considered when you're trying to be inclusive in designing public space, and knowing where, you know, what your policy and what your legislation is sort of to support this, and having the evidence base. I think there's a few questions in the chat. I'm just going to ask one to start with, but I wondered how you were talking about sort of getting in those very early stages of development. And again, I mean, similarly with active travel schemes, you know, the earlier that you can engage with kind of the idea, you know, before the design of the street, thinking about the network and thinking about and that can be really, really challenging. And I wondered how you were going about that. I mean, presumably you being small, you're having to be quite targeted at you know, in those early stages, or are you aiming high and kind of going into, you know, where are you sort of targeting that?
The thing is, nobody has done any of this on purpose. It's just because they haven't thought about it. So the main thing is just to get as many people aware of it, because when they do, they're like, oh heck, you know, I've park designers have gone, I'm never designing another dead end path again in my life. So a lot of it is just about talking to people like this. And we do lots of CPD for architects, so that when they're there at the beginning of a scheme, they can say, oh, actually, we don't have to have a Muga here. We don't have to have a skate park. Let's have a skate park and something else. So that's really important. We're also, interestingly, working with quite a lot of developers now, where they've got a big scheme with a lot of urban space. I think from a social value point of view, most of all, they are really interested in incorporating ideas, you know, and demonstrating that they're trying to build a more inclusive neighborhood. So we've been really lucky with this, in that developers have actually come to us and said, can we talk?
Yeah, because that's where you need to get in there, don't you? Where things are, you know, being created for the first time. I think that it gets more difficult when you're replacing things, doesn't it? Just to have those sort of political discussions about what stays and what goes. We've got a couple of hands up. I'll take those first, and then I'll go through the questions in the chat while other people are thinking. Robert, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to, I pointed it out in the chat. Caroline Corrado Perez had a podcast, which Imogen, your colleague Susannah, was on the other day about this very topic. I listened to Caroline because she's just amazing in terms of quality and equality. But it was really obvious to me, some of the questions, some of the things that you've raised tonight. And I would strongly recommend other people to both listen to that particular podcast if you can get hold of it, and follow her generally if you're interested in things like equality, and because it affects active travel. Her book on invisible women, particularly throughout the issues of non-radial routes for cycling and active travel, because most women are the caregivers in that situation, and their need for routes is different from us men, generally speaking, because they go and drop off school and they go to do some shopping and then they go to do something else, rather than just straight in and out to work or to one particular destination. So I'd strongly recommend you both read her books and follow her on Twitter and podcasts and stuff.
Yes,
absolutely brilliant.
We basically exist because of Caroline Corrado Perez, because there's 3 pages about parks and invisible women, and I read that. I had to read the book in small doses because I got so angry, but I read that and I looked at the town I live in, and we have a skate park and a BMX track and a Muga, And I'm a feminist and I have a teenage daughter, and I'd still never seen it. And I was absolutely like, oh my goodness, why did I not see this? And then I talked to our local council, who were not as receptive as they could be and said quite a few sexist things. So in fact, I got so angry, I then talked to Imogen, who is the lawyer, and the rest is history. So it's all Caroline Criado-Perez's fault.
I, as a kind of feminist, fundamentally thought I knew a lot about the difficulties about women and stuff. And I read her book and then have become an evangelist for her altogether.
Yeah.
I learned so much from that book. It's just, thoroughly recommend it to everybody.
And if you go onto our website, there's a section called In the Media. And at the very top of that, there's a YouTube video of us having a chat with her, if you want more of the same.
That's great to know. Thank you very much. Thanks, Robert. That was a very generous comment. And Mark, you have a hand up.
Thanks. Yes, I'm actually staring above the screen at Invisible Women, who sits on my bookshelf right at the moment. And that's not just, it just is there. I'm in Brighton, and the council has renovated about 10 playgrounds and about to renovate 20 more. And constantly two of the things that come up is exactly what you've been talking about, and also that it's all for kids. It's little kids. It's nothing is for older teenagers. My son's 17, so he's moved on from that sort of stuff now, really. But that, so what I'd like to do, because I have contacts with the Green Group, is the administration, is whether you'd come and do a presentation to the Children and Youth Committee met yesterday, so you've missed that cycle, but it would have been brilliant to have you there and inform that sort of thing. Do you do that sort of thing? Or are you just too busy to go and speak to councillors?
No, we really, really, really want to speak to councillors. And again, the crucial thing is also it's about play strategies. Somebody's just messaging about play strategies at the moment, and getting the idea of consulting with people who are not currently users. Because the problem is everyone goes, well, we've had a consultation with the park users, but the girls are so disengaged with parks. They see there's nothing there for them. So when we put out calls for surveys, it's really interesting, because girls don't respond to surveys about parks because it's not theirs. Whereas if you go girl skateboarders, you're kind of like, oh, okay, stop the stampede, because they understand I'm a skateboarder, I have opinions on this. But girls are just like, parks, boff. So you have to do some quite hard outreach to go and talk to them, which is also part of what we do. But yes, absolutely, we are always very happy to do a presentation and to, again, to talk through even more of the case studies and the examples, because that's what's so joyful. Is it's not like, oh, we've all been bad and we have to, it's like, look, there's lots of really beautiful things in fantastic colours that we could build.
I just wanted one other comment, which is there is an intersectionality with racial issues here, because you see a lot of playgrounds that are built with, oh, we put in a baseball hoop because black kids love, it's an assumption, black kids love to play baseball, we'll put a baseball hoop, we've ticked off ethnic minority groups, done. And I think those issues, some of those basic assumptions are similar. They're not the same, obviously, but they're quite similar in thought processes to what you've been talking about.
And I think the crucial thing in that is to consult with, intersectionality is so intersectional that you have to work out how it is actually working in your area and what the issues are. Because we've done some very interesting, we've been working with an ongoing health project in Bradford, where they are putting park equipment in to try and get to raise activity levels, with a big emphasis on the South Asian community there. And the difference in responses between two groups of teenage girls from, places that are even only 1.5 miles apart is crucial. So you have to really, that's why the consultation is so important, because it will tell you actually what is going on in your space. And there was in the very early Vienna stuff, there was a really interesting thing where in the first park they worked in, they were aware that lots of girls from Turkish immigrant communities were only using the park as teenagers when they took their little siblings down to the park. So they then just installed social seating for them, so at least they could chat while they were overseeing their siblings. So it really is about consulting and noticing at that level to make sure you get the right answers for your very particular place.
I think that's such an important point. I think there are these sort of things that we can generalize, but kind of that basic understanding of what the need is, you can't do away with that, because places, the research does say that places have, you can put the same equipment in two different places and it will be used completely differently, and the culture around it and who uses and who doesn't is completely different.
Also, I just say the reputation of your space. You can't. We were working with the council in the Midlands that I will not name any further because they were quite embarrassed about one of their parks. But one of the parks had a really dodgy reputation, and it had a skate park and a Muga and something else in it, and it was basically coded male and seen as dodgy. And it's like, don't try there. Get the girls into the parks that are going to be easiest for them to access first, and then you can't just change everything. It has to be incremental. So also, the cultural knowledge of what your spaces are like is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Ali, do you got a question or a comment?
Yeah, it's a question. So you touched earlier on sort of space for older children and teenagers. I'm not sure whether this is like a UK specific thing or it's across the globe or whatever, but how do you think you can challenge like adults' attitudes towards teenagers, even if it's, even if you put in appropriate space? I feel like maybe adults in and around that space might have bad perceptions of what those teenagers are doing. Like, we have Facebook groups are the place where enthusiasm goes to die, but we have on our Facebook group complaints about teenagers hanging out all the time and all they're doing is walking around. And I guess I'm not sure how we can tackle that perception, whether that's through infrastructure or you think something else needs to happen alongside it. Sorry, I know that's not really your ballpark, but I'm just interested.
No, I'm so there for that question, because one of the things we find is we actually end up, because nobody else is doing it, not just advocating for teenage girls, but actually saying exactly that. Don't demonize the teenagers who are loitering in the park. You don't say to old people, stop loitering on the benches in the park. But if you're just wrong for being a teenager, basically. I think there's a number of things. One is just, as you say, to challenge that attitude. I think the second thing is that because of the way that parks are used at the moment, the dominant group does tend to be, let's say, the most leery. So if you can attract other teenagers and other groups into the park, then you can do that. And I think this idea of breaking up spaces is really important, because if you've got dotted groups of teenagers around the park, they're a lot less threatening than if they're all gathered on one teen shelter, and yet we still go and build the teen shelter. There has been some work done, and there's a really interesting scheme in Aberystwyth where they have a skate park, but there's a really wide route leading into it. It's like 7 meters wide, and it's a shared space. And this was built because the teenagers said, oh, the old people just grumbled at us, and the old people say, oh, the teenagers just ignored us. And so they built this shared space, and it's designed so that just occasionally you'll have to stop for somebody else. And apparently, I am told by the people who built it, who clearly obviously have a reason to say this, so I don't have any absolute research on this, but they say that that has actually improved relationships in that park. So then, and I think there is so much more work that you've got to do on that. But also, one of the things is actually just to give them something to do. There's a park we're working on in Bath called Brickfields, which is way away from the posh, tourist bit of Bath. It's in a place you'd never go to, if you didn't know the area. But fascinatingly, it's by a girls' school, and at the moment it's got football pitches and a basketball pitch on top of a hill with no fences, which they seem to manage to cope with. But the teenage girls, and it took a lot of work with the girls from the school to get this out of them, but the school was telling them not to go to the park. And we were like, why are the school telling you not to go to the park? This seems weird. Because what happens was, because there's no facilities for teenagers, they would then go and play on the toddler facilities and the young kids facilities, and all the parents would ring on their way home, because it's a massive route through. The school then the parents ring up the school going, your girls are being, so they end up being told not to go to the park, but it's not their fault. They only want to play, but we haven't given them anything to do. So we're actually putting in some stuff for girls, hopefully in spring next year, in that park, and we will see if that changes the dynamic a bit. So I think actually just giving them something to do and a place to hang out and permission from the facilities. Good, I hope, but let's try. There is a fantastic scheme, I didn't have time to include it, in Umeå in Sweden, who've done a lot of really good work. And it's designed for teenage girls, and they hang out in it until 7 o'clock at night. So, you know, and nobody complains about it. So I think the built environment can work. Short answer.
Yeah, and we've never really have designed teenagers into public space in the UK, not on a kind of, you know, any sort of scale, if at all. And I guess it'll be interesting. I mean, I suppose that kind of leads on to, you know, to what extent you're going to be able to follow up on some of the work that you've been involved in. I guess that's sort of starting to build kind of confidence in people putting things in when they see how they have been received.
We've got, I mean, the Yorkshire Sport research has been really helpful because it's just changed perceptions a lot. And that people are looking at that and go, okay, so boys don't want Moogers either. Maybe we need to rethink this. But yes, in Brickfields, we've had some students monitoring the usage of the space before anything's gone in, and we'd hope to repeat that over the summer. And also, I think, qualitatively talk to the school and see if they're getting fewer irritated parents with toddlers ringing up. But there is what they did in Vienna, which was really interesting, was they put in these small scale interventions in the parks and then measured the results. And I would love, that's on our wish list of things that we would love to do, because it would, to know what works and to be able to say with confidence, yes, that resulted in a 20%. It has happened in Sweden, but not here yet. But yes, absolutely.
Yeah, great. That's great to hear. Ruth and Claire, do you want to ask your questions?
Yes, that was fab. Thanks, Susannah. Two things I wanted to ask you. I think we've had a comment on these sessions, where the police are kind of actively asking councils to remove things that where children gather. And tragically in Chiswick, there was a beautiful tree they put a bench all the way around it, a circular bench, in memory of a young girl who died of a drug overdose at a party, age 15, and all her mates used to hang around there. And then horribly, the older people who lived in the kind of flats overlooking this thing kind of complained to the police and said, these kids are all hanging about. So I just wondered if you've ever had any contact with police about these things. And just quickly to say, I was brought up in Chester, the Rose in Chester, where we hung around there quite happily. We had nothing to do, but we just hung around there, and it was a wonderful space. And obviously times have changed. But thank you. I'd just be curious to know whether you get relationship with the police about any of this.
Yeah, we're working currently on a project about women and girls' safety in parks, which is a big multidisciplinary thing that's being run by the University of Leeds, and the police are involved with that. Yes, secured by design is better than it was, but it does still seem to be quite involved in removing teenagers from everywhere. And I think the answer to what you're saying is to go back to the idea that we just have to get over ourselves vis-a-vis teenagers, and that they need spaces and they have a right to be outdoors, and they have it's their human rights. And so we have to provide spaces where they're not causing trouble. And again, I think the more spaces we provide, then hopefully there will be less trouble if they're not all in one place, because that, I think, is part of the issue. Yes, it is on our wish list of things that in an ideal world we'd like to fix. But what are you doing? You're just moving it to somewhere else. And I will tell you off the record, the most funny example of this is there's a skate park company built on skate parks who say, and our skate parks reduce antisocial behaviour. This happened in Salisbury. And what happened in Salisbury was that everyone was skateboarding down the steps of the police station. So they didn't remove antisocial behaviour, they just gave it a place where it wasn't antisocial. And I think to some degree, that's kind of what you have to think about. Let's, rather than just going, let's erase all the benches, bushes and teenagers off the face of the earth, where is a good place for them to go? How can we make better places for them to go where they're not going to cause trouble or be annoying to people, or we all just get over ourselves a bit?
Thanks, Susannah. Claire, do you want to come in with your...
Thank you. Yeah, really enjoying this tonight. My question is about, so there's been a bit in the chat about, well, some boys don't enjoy boys spaces, and boys and girls, it's very binary. And as someone who isn't necessarily very stereotypical of their gender, like, do you feel like in the long run the objective would be about designing places for reflection, places for taking Instagram, places for doing parkour, places for skateboarding, rather than it being a gender thing? Because that's very binary, and not all girls like X and not all boys like Y.
Yes, we are partly binary because of the public sector equality duty, because that's that's our lever to get things done, and that specifies sex. But we are very clear that when you create spaces that include teenage girls, you are, as I said, you're making it more inclusive for everybody. For the boys who don't want to take part in that, for LGBTQA plus teenagers who don't want to be, it works for everyone. And there's a really good bit of American, observation called the curb cut effect, which is about, and I Google it, but basically when you make a place more inclusive, it tends to be more inclusive across the board. And it's very rarely that somebody gets disadvantaged, but lots of other groups than the ones you intend tend to benefit. And we very much feel that that is what would happen with this. It's worth noting that in Sweden, where they did do some research, they designed a park entirely with a group of teenage girls and young women. And at the end of that result, because part of the reason they did it is they realized that in all their teen spaces, it was 80% boys using it. That only took the share up to girls were then 43% of the users. So it's so kind of loaded against girls that we do need to just go, let's design things for girls. And then actually what we'll probably end up with is just a more egalitarian park.
Thanks, Susannah. Just to kind of go back to a little bit to kind of the question before that about kind of secure by design, and I guess over quite a long period, a lot of money went into youth services, and then that in the last over a decade has been pretty much like slashed to almost zero in a lot of places, and there's been an increase in policing and the introduction of things like ASBOs and various iterations of that, and I suppose just wonder what you think about whether there's this turn to designing space for young people to hang out in, which we haven't ever had really as a policy. How that kind of, how, in terms of how does that intersect with policing, and is there support? We talked about secure by design. How do you get support for that for policing? And just like sort of linked in with that, then idea of social safety. Somebody has asked in the chat about things, really basic stuff like lighting in parks, and how easy is it to get local authorities who don't have the budgets to kind of support that interventions like that.
Oh, lots of questions. Yes, it's difficult. However, I think the thing that we have to remember is that the teenagers who are causing trouble are actually a minority. Because the vast majority of teenagers are not hanging out in parks at night. They're doing their homework and watching something strange on YouTube at home. And that a lot of it is about enticing the other teenagers into the park to kind of dilute that. And again, it just goes back to they've got a right to be there. Somebody else has also said, how do you reach the councils who don't care about this? Is you just have to keep going, and some won't. And there is a certain level of, I am 30 years in parks and recreation, don't tell me I've been doing wrong for all this time. But on the budget thing, there's two things. One is that there is continual refurbishment, and if we can just persuade them to think about equalities when they do it. I lost my rag with the local council when they said, oh, and we've got all these boys facilities, we're going to upgrade the skate park for £350,000. And I went, I don't think so, actually. So there is money out there, but crucially, the way to, and I suspect this must apply to a lot of what you do in active travel as well, is that we're finding the way into budgets is through health, because it's a clear and simple health intervention, and there is a ton of research as to how it works for health for girls, that girls who go to parks are more active, just full stop. The act of getting to the park makes them more, gives them greater activity level. Swings are a great form of moderate physical activity. Let's have some swings. The mental health things, that it's through active landscapes, the active partnerships, that actually I think a lot of the funding for this is going to come through. I think, was that all the bits? I think that was all the bits.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Thank you.
Sorry, I also want to say, somebody's just said, I love swings which have them at bus stops. I know we're not supposed to like the Russians at the moment, but they're really good at swings that are not only, they're in public spaces, in like along riverbanks and in public squares, and they've got lids on them, so you can use them all year. Let's have more of this kind of thing. Definitely more swings. Adam, do you want to come in?
I was just wondering, because there's probably a lot of unconscious bias that comes into the space, particularly in transport, with, there's quite a heavy bias towards male transport planners, etc. But is there like a kind of recipe or a blueprint that you kind of recommend for these types of spaces, or is that still being developed?
Yes, I think, there is a list of very general recommendations, which I whizzed past very quickly. We can now, I think we're getting reasonably good at looking at a plan and seeing where the problems are. Because one of the things I didn't touch on, because this was really much just a very top level thing, is that skate parks don't just exclude girls. They are actually a problem for girls. They are a discouragement. And again, the research shows this, that they are less likely to go to places if there's a skate park. And they will avoid the area. So if you try to put a facility for teenage girls next to the skate park, which is basically, as far as they're concerned, a bowl full of boys who might shout rubbish at you, why would you go near it? Then it's not going to work. So it's also about balancing passive surveillance from other facilities in the park, and also looking at access, because you could build the most amazing park in the world, and if you had to access it by a shonky underpass, you're not going to go there. So it's a bit like the consultation. Yes, you can say some general things, but it's always good to actually just really analyze a plan and a layout and a set of ideas. And because these solutions are often really simple. It's just about swapping things over or moving things, and just acknowledging that there's a lot of stuff that's coded male. I was looking at a park yesterday for a developer that admittedly their excuse is they applied for planning permission in 2014, but it's the main park for a new development. It had 3 pitches, a mooga, a skate park, and a kick around area on the main bit of grass. And it's like, and the girls will just sit in the little tiny bits around the edges, shall they? I was hard pressed to say anything positive about that, but anyway, okay.
I'd kind of leading on from that, there's a question in the chat from Steve, who's a bit under the weather, who'd like me to read it. And he says, there's a lot of debate around the future of parks, different ownership models, future parks accelerator with the National Trust and more. Is any of this gaining traction in that debate? And could we write gender equity into the parks endowments, for example?
Yes, we Future Parks Accelerator have been really supportive, and yes, we are finding, partly because they can get the money, that the parks trusts, like we're working with Your Park, which is the Bristol and Bath Parks Trust, is very useful. I think getting it written in the endowments, I think there are other places I would get it written into first. Firstly, just getting it written into play strategies where they just don't consider it. They often go teenage facilities like a mooga and a skate park. And so getting that unconscious bias out of play strategies. I just want to say, because somebody mentioned play strategies before, it's on our Twitter. Dublin City Council have just produced I would say it's a really good play strategy. It's got our logo in it. It's great, but it really considers teenage girls, but also lots of other intersectionalities, because they have issues with travellers and all sorts of stuff. But it's really about reaching out to lots of different user groups and thinking about it. And I'd really recommend that as a model. The other thing that needs change, it's not the bane of my life because they are changing it. Fields in Trust have their 6-acre standard, which is all about the guidance for where you put play areas. That says team facilities like mooga and skate park, and the number of councils who say to us, we've got to have a mooga in the skate park because the Fields in Trust say it's so. So Fortunately, they are now consulting about changing that, and they do understand that that is a problem. But yes, there's a whole world of accidental, implicit discrimination that needs to be tackled. But yeah, if somebody wants to set up a Parks Trust and write it in, I think that would be great as well.
And have you had much involvement then with Fields Interest?
Yes, I went to their meeting last week. It was very exciting because we we sort of approached them about a year ago, and they were like, no, we're not changing it. And now they are consulting about inclusivity and also environmental issues around it. And they are definitely listening.
That's really good to hear. Has anybody got any more questions for Susannah? Have I missed any in the chat? I'm just trying to scan through. Somebody's asked about ideas for small spaces. I sort of covered that.
Yeah, well, on the small spaces, the Malmo scheme is really interesting to look at, because they had a policy in the city of taking little tiny corners of unused urban space and creating very small teenage facilities out of them, which again, it's small, it's not going to cause a ruckus. But then they realised that after 14 parks, they built 12 skate parks and they were mostly used by boys. So they had to do a quick rethink.
I think if nobody's got any more questions, I'm sure everybody will want to join me in thanking Susannah. That was a really fantastic presentation, a really, really interesting discussion. I think you'll be hearing from lots of people who like you.
Please do get in.
Parks.
It was lovely to get to speak to you all. Please do come and talk to us. We're always very happy to hear from people.
And vice versa. And I think now you know where to come if there are people who want to talk to how we get teenage girls.
Yeah,
to parks.
Yes, brilliant.
Independently. So thank you, Susannah. And I'm going to bring in Ranty Highwayman. Mark, are you there?
Thank you.
Hi, I'm here.
I'll let you share your screen.
Okay, let's go for it. Are we all seeing this?
Yeah, all good.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks very much. So, good, the bad, and interesting this week, I think, is interesting. So, we're across the North Sea. I've had a wonderful few days over in Delft, Rotterdam, and Hoek of Holland. Week and a half ago now, losing track of time. And what struck me cycling around is all the Dutch hills that I came across, including this very small Dutch hill. But in fact, lots and lots of bridges where the cycle tracks are part of the bridge or attached to the bridge, forming additions to the network. So I was going to go through a few photos, which is a good excuse for some holiday snaps, pick up a few issues as we go through, and at the end I'm going to pose a question for the UK. Apologies to any Dutch listeners with my pronunciations, I probably won't pronounce them. But here we have a road which is so new. It's kind of along the river Maas, which has got lots of redevelopment work and industrial places being upgraded, business parks and all sorts. But we do have here cycle track as part of a bridge. All very nice, all very tidy, all very new. As we get a bit closer to Rotterdam, to the west of the city, here's the Benelux Tunnel. This is the South Portal, and this is part of the A4 motorway. It was opened in 2002 as part of adding a second bore, I think it was, to the overall Benelux Tunnel, which goes on again under the river Maas. Interesting, you can see from the top here, you can just make out the lift. I've read up, and what we're told is there's a lift there, there's also an escalator, and it's kind of in tandem because of the width of space I had to actually fit this thing in. So here you go. If you fancy it, you go on the escalator, fairly easy with your bike, and you can see the two-way cycle track in the very skinny portion of the tunnel at the bottom. And here we are in action, an action shot going through. And the thing about this particular tunnel is, of course, as you go towards the centre of the river, you're going downhill, and it's wonderful. And as you hit the middle, you come up the other side, and it's a hill again. But here we have another piece of infrastructure pragmatically built as part of a much bigger scheme. We're now on the, that should be the east of Rotterdam, actually, not the west. this is another sort of hybrid scheme. There's a big floodgate here at Algira Brug. It carries in 210. So the inroads are regional roads rather than motorways. The bridge was last renovated in 2009. And the thing you find a lot in the Netherlands is even the smallest bridges have names. You can quite often find a bit about them on the Dutch Wikipedia. And often things are multifunctional. So here we are, another pragmatic way across a smaller river this time, a tributary of the main Maas River. So we're now east again of the main city of Rotterdam. This is part of the A16 motorway. The bridge, like in the UK, the Dutch like to build lots of roads, and they doubled the size of this one in 1990. You can see on the right-hand side, the original bridge, on the left-hand side, the new bridge, and at the very left-hand side, you can see that sort of long reddish pipe held up by the grey pipes. So that's actually a cycle track. Here we are on the top. Now, this very much is a Dutch hill. Takes a bit of effort to get up here. It's quite noisy. It's not a nice place to be, windy and exposed, but it gets you across the River Maas, connects to neighbourhoods, to industrial areas. So again, a cycle track attached to a bridge. You can walk it if you fancy it, but it's about 1.3 kilometres long, so you're probably going to cycle it. This particular bridge does lift up for the very, very biggest ships coming along the river, but it doesn't happen that often, but it takes about 18 minutes to lift apparently. In Rotterdam itself, the Erasmus Bridge, that carries the S106, which is like a ring road within the city, completed in 1996. And of course, there's a cycle track on it. In this case, with flow cycle tracks on each side, footways on each side, and there's a central tram line. So this is probably what you'd expect from a city centre type bridge anyway, that you would have a multimodal solution. We're now up to Delft. This is, I'm not even going to try and pronounce this one, on the edge of Delft in the university part of the city. Again, it's a regional road, the N470 this time. I couldn't find the age of this particular bridge, but it goes over a canal. And again, not the best place to be. It's a dual carriageway, it's a bit noisy, but it's a very pragmatic connection. And nearly to the end of my slides, this is another bridge out to the kind of southwest of Delft on the way to the Hook of Holland. It's the N470 in this case, and it goes over another motorway. So again, cycle track with a road bridge over a big barrier. So what this does is beg the question, why don't we do this as a matter of routine in the UK, even if we're only creating a rudimentary local connection, and we can come in later and do something. So for example, like it or loathe it, we're building the Silvertown Tunnel. Well, we're trying to build the Silvertown Tunnel, it's underway now. Lower Thames crossing, why aren't there at least cycle tracks associated with these massive, massive multi-billion-pound schemes? We could also go along and retrofit some of our motorways. So the M25 is a good example in my neck of the woods. Lots of places where it skirts built-up areas that could benefit from another connection. Again, noisy, not particularly pleasant, I guess, but you're there quick and it provides that connection. Probably a rhetorical question, but here we go. Open to discussion and views. I shall stop sharing now.
Thank you. Oh, we can just only envy that amazing infrastructure and investment.
And there's Dutch hills, and they're hard to go over.
What can we say? Yeah. It looks like you had a good trip as well. Does anybody got any questions or comments? Or Ruth's there now. She's going to rub it in.
Which bridge are you on, Ruth?
Sorry, I've had to move to my phone. I don't know how to do Zoom on a phone. No, very quickly, the last bridge you shown was built mandatorily when they widened the motorway, which was to get the flower traffic quickly from near Utrecht, actually, to Hook. They actually were not allowed to build it without building a proper cycle bridge over the top. And that is the way they look at things. Like they've got animal bridges and all these kind of bridges, but they pay a lot more taxes than we do. It is part of the infrastructure. It has to be built, and it has to be, I know Brian's not here, so cheekily I can say he and I disagree about the Crow manual because I think it works and we don't adhere to it here, sadly. But Thank you.
I think with Dutch pay more taxes and all of that stuff. If you're spending billions and billions on a motorway, a few connections are not really big in the scheme of it. So national highways, at least in England, I can't really talk for the devolved authorities, but national highways have something called the designated fund, the designated funds, which from what I can work out is where they get lots of pressure because they've completely missed doing something like this. They dip into it to actually deal with what they should have done in the first place. Really, if you're building a really, really big bridge, we talk about some fairly massive structures here. To add a cantilever cycle track, in terms of the load and the space and everything, it's nothing really.
No, but it's the joining up. I mean, it's the fact that the municipalities will insist that, you know, Rotterdam Town Centre had to agree to all this new major stuff that they've been doing surrounding Rotterdam, and people couldn't object to it. They did. They had a referendum, and some of them said no, and the municipality said, well, we're going to build it anyway.
Thanks, Ruth. Yeah, I guess as well, we have a lot of kind of, because we don't have standards on roads between urban settlements, we've got a lot of creep, haven't we? So we have we have single carriageway, which people are expected to cycle on, and then when that's dualed, you know, there's not a kind of default. You now have to provide cycling infrastructure, and then cycling kind of gets designed out at that point, you know, I guess. Robert, do you have a question or a point?
Yeah, no, thanks for the photos. It reminds me of my last big cycling trip out to Europe, where I cycled from Newcastle to London via Amsterdam, Delft, Rotterdam, and down through to Dunkirk. It was fabulous, but extraordinarily depressing the minute I hit Dover, because it was. I'm going to be quite controversial because it's maybe something that other people have heard me say before. I think the reason that we're not successful in doing any major cycling infrastructure builds like this is because we are concentrating far too much on local effort, and that as a national presence, we do not have a single voice which says this is what we should be doing for everybody's sake. And I strongly believe that now. The more I've participated in this discussion over the years and locally in Newcastle, until we get a single national voice which says this is what we should do, we should stick to the Crow manual, it works, take all the positive research that's been done elsewhere to say cycling and walking infrastructure improves retail footfall, it regenerates town centres and everything else. Until we have a national loud voice doing that all the time, you will get the ignorance and the stupidity that we encounter every single day with dealing with piecemeal projects in local authorities, where we big up simple, small pieces of detached cycling infrastructure, as we have done in Newcastle, and say this is brilliant, it's been done, and we don't have a secure, safe cycle route from some of the more populated areas, such as where I live in the west end of Newcastle and Central Station. It's just not there, and because we concentrate on individual local projects, which may be street level or even city level, but we don't have a national body doing this. That's my 10 pence. I'll shut up now.
Thanks, Robert. We do have a national cycling campaign who are doing that, and I think I would strongly suggest getting more involved with that if that's like something that you want them to do, to do more of. And we have talked about inviting them. They now have the Cycling UK now has a cycling action network. Is that right? We've talked about getting them on to talk about that, to talk about how they're, that's supposedly kind of joining up that national and that local effort. And I think that is really, is a really kind of key thing. So it would be good to pick that up again, definitely. Tim?
I have literally just joined Cycling UK on the basis of resign my membership of British Cycling the other month.
Yeah, well, yeah, that would be interesting to see how you get on with that.
Yeah.
Maybe feedback. Tim.
Thanks, and sorry I was late and I missed the show. Just thinking about my local neck of the woods, where we've got a pinch point railway bridge on the A47 into Leicester, which the bus lane starts immediately afterwards. If you can get over the bridge before being flattened by the HGV, you're okay because you're in the bus lane down the hill. It's on the Ivanhoe line, which is one of those lines that just carries freight currently, but might reopen Leicester to Burton if Grant Shapps, it's one of those railway improvement schemes. And my first thought was sling a bike bridge alongside it, because unless you do that, people are still not going to come in from a major housing development out at Leicester Forest East into the city safely unless they detour through my park. So I just wondered about costs really of putting one in bi-directional on one side of the bridge, hanging it off a Victorian brick-built bridge over single track, I think it is.
You'd probably have a separate bridge, to be honest, in that situation. But that kind of bridge, I mean, I don't know the span, that's everything, but that kind of bridge, that kind of feel, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 million pounds, that kind of level. But if that's the answer, that's the answer, because alternatively, you put in some kind of traffic signal shuttle working to give yourself a bit of space, which will obviously send people mad because of the congestion. So yeah, if the solution's a bridge, build a bridge. That's what we should be doing, I think. Even if we can't connect everything up now, get it in, get the land reserved.
Yeah, I would add that Leicester has put in 2 new cycle bridges in the last 5 years. They're still working on one, and it's usually when they're having to repair a Victorian bridge make it deal with the HGVs. They then sling one of these. They look at the Second World War in one sense. Those arch bridges in, which I'm very pleased about because I live in Leicester. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Simon.
The Forest Klaxon. I know which one you're going to talk about.
You've got it. No, I wasn't going to talk about the Canty bridges, actually. I was just going to jump back very briefly and just say, as a little bit of a plug for the fact that I think I'm due to speak next week at Active Travel Cafe, it's just all the talk about things like Crow Manual and what the Dutch do. I just think it's really important to kind of highlight the fact that we have to deal with what we have to deal with right here, right now, as it were. So I'm just a really big fan of putting one foot in front of the other, and that's where you get to Waltham Forest and Canty bridges and £1 million schemes or whatever. But yeah, I was just going to throw that one in.
Thanks, Simon. Anybody else? I'm just going to read Mark's comment. I think everybody will have seen that there is a manual on trunk roads which is binding on national highways, but that's it's unfortunately we're not always seeing what we should be seeing. Why is that?
Oh, it's a good question. I need to be careful what I say as well. I mean, in general terms, you get the design manual for roads and bridges, where you've got the chapters on cycling, walking, everything else, and there are things about footbridges and underpasses. What you tend to see is the designers involved going for the absolute minimums rather than actually designing something which is kind of fit for purpose. I think the problem is if you're designing to the minimum all the time, in the situations we're talking about, maybe it's a more rural situation, it's not about flow or capacity, it's just about the thing feeling nice. So if you've got a really narrow bridge you're crossing and you've got parapets on both sides or walls or whatever, you feel enclosed. So you need a certain level of space to feel comfortable. And there's always seems to be, let's drop back and put shared use paths everywhere. Again, they might be fine in certain locations. But again, it's going for the minimum. And certainly where we've got, for England, we've got local transport note 120. That's far superior than the design manual for roads and bridges. That's old hat now. I mean, what they brought out 4 or 5 years ago was kind of cutting edge, but the local guidance is head and shoulders above it. But national highways will follow their own standard. That's the problem. And often the project managers don't know enough to challenge the designers on what they're doing.
Thanks. That's interesting to have that kind of.
Can I just add, there is another problem with CD 195, which is that it's design manual for cycle traffic. So there's a very simple get out for all highway national highways designers. They just call it shared use, and for shared use, I think the standards go back to 1995, and they're really crap. And so that's how they get round it all.
Thanks, Mark. Graham, do you want to come in really quickly, and that'll be the last question or comment, and then we're going to wrap it up.
Very quickly, I attended the meeting in Parliament where the head of Highways England admitted that he had no provisions for cycling. This is a few years ago, and said he'd do something about it. So my immediate response to why isn't it happening so much is that I'm sure that head of Highways England is no longer there to remind people that he made that assertion. I mean, when the first stuff came out, what by Phil Jones and others, perhaps you, Mark, I thought it was pretty good. But I have noticed too around Oxfordshire that it gets ignored, even on non-trunk roads when ACOM won't use manual for streets because it's not appropriate. They won't use the cycling part of the DMRB. End of it.
Yeah, you do find on projects, and county projects are especially notorious. People will pick and choose what guidance and standards they'll use. So it's very easy to say, okay, we'll pick that out because that's a minimum, but we'll go to that document because that's a minimum, rather than doing things properly. So there's definitely a big thing around, again, whether you agree with them or not, if things are being built, they need to be built with that kind of thing in mind. I won't mention a county, that'll be unfair, but I think lots of people know which ones.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Mark. I think everybody will join me in saying that was really lovely to see all of those photographs, and we wish we had more of that here. And I am delighted to say that we're hoping to have Mark again next week. And we've also, as Simon's flagged up, we have Simon Monk, who's going to talk about the Pathways approach, 4 steps for active travel campaigners to get councils to deliver. So that's really looking forward to that. We have filled most of our slots for the next few weeks, but we're starting to think ahead now for talks for future sessions. So, you know, if anything that you've heard tonight, so maybe you think I'd really like to know more about this, if you're able to go away and do a bit of research, or, you know, find out who'd be a really good person to talk, we'd love to get some more ideas for speakers, and you can email us or get in touch via Twitter. But thank you very much, and really great to see those people who have joined us for the first time. We hope you'll come back again, and hope you all have a good week, and we'll see you next week. Bye everyone.